the beginning of this launch for the Institute of Advanced Studies time theme today. I hope you won't mind a very quick bit of history, because we're very proud of what we've achieved in our Institute of Advanced Studies at Loughborough. We only launched in May 2017, so it's a bit over 3 years that we've been running. And already we've welcomed 194 visiting fellows from 34 countries. In fact, it's probably a few more now since those fellows were counted up. And fair to say that the Institute for Advanced Studies has won a place in the intellectual heart of colleagues across our campuses in the Midlands and in London as well. Over the last year, we've also added a residential fellowship scheme into the Institute, and that's been a very significant step for us. And our second residential fellow is with us at the moment. So it's great to have that scheme going. Now, I'm very aware that I'm saying a few words actually halfway through the actual event, because I know you've had a performance part to the event already. I wasn't sure if I ought to apologise for turning up to say a few words of welcome in a launch halfway through the actual event, or if in fact the ambiguity that I embody in terms of when is the right time was actually wholly appropriate on this occasion. And maybe it captures neatly how engineers like me, who usually hold that time is objectively measurable, can actually sometimes subscribe a little bit more to the view from the humanities and social sciences, who are more interested in how time is socially constructed. In fact, the objectively measurable bit of time has been very important to me in my own research, where I've spent possibly too much time thinking about displacements and velocities and accelerations of a variety of oscillating structures, but time's absolutely critical to those kind of studies. Today, turning up as I am halfway through the event to say words of welcome, I'm clearly embracing more of the social construct. And so I'm going to tell you that it was always part of the plan for me to turn up midway and inject that ambiguity as an intellectual stimulation to begin this afternoon's event. I have to say, one of the really enjoyable things about my role as PVCR is the time that I spend listening to colleagues describe their passions for research across all the diverse disciplines that we have in the university. And the Institute of Advanced Studies has really taken that to another level with events that bring colleagues together, not just from Loughborough and from the worldwide academic community, but across disciplines that don't routinely engage to discuss matters of mutual interest. And so a very warm welcome to everybody here today, especially to guests from outside Loughborough. I don't know if Lawrence has found a way to listen to this launch on his car radio halfway up the motorway or wherever he is. But particularly welcome and a thank you to our external speakers who are joining the theme today, to Lawrence, who's a physicist from Nottingham, to Megan, who's a philosopher from University of Notre Dame in Indiana, to Jutta, who's an art historian. And I wasn't sure, Jutta, whether you were speaking to us from Birmingham or from Erfurt in Germany, but I know from what you said just a few moments ago that you're in Germany. Between the three of you, you're absolutely the embodiment of the diversity that characterises IAS, both in terms of your geographical locations, but also in terms of your disciplinary interests. So I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating Friday afternoon for everybody. And to finish off, I'll say something like, let me declare this theme launched. I don't have a big bottle to smash onto the side of an IAS ship, but I'll do it proverbially. Marcia, I hand back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve. It's my pleasure really to hand over to Toralf, who's going to represent the time team today and welcome our speakers and tell us a little bit about the notion of having a trialogue. So Toralf, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Marcia, for the welcome. And I want to join both of you in welcoming our three speakers, as well as the audience, and I'm really pleased at the turnout. I think we're having a really good turnout. There are names that I recognized, there are names that I did not recognize, which hopefully indicates that we have a very diverse audience that will join us in this what I've called a trialogue, to learn a bit more about how different academic disciplines conceptualize time. Maybe I just want to briefly introduce the members of the time team. You can see two of them, I think, on the screen. If you have the same screen I do, Alex Zagoskin, first from left in the second row, Ariana Majorani, sorry, Ariana, first in the third row, and then a bit further down. Oh yeah, we've got Peter as well, Peter Kowalek, just turned on his camera. So that's us. We've had intensive discussions trying to set this up, trying to formulate a concept, what we want to do with time, because it is a vast subject area, and obviously we had to be selective. I think one of the key themes that emerged when we started these conversations amongst the time team, as we are known, was that we wanted to think about how we conceptualize time. What are we actually talking about when we talk about time? And I think an interesting moment that in a way captures the necessity to come to an understanding of what we mean by time was actually given by the Vice Chancellor at the end of the art project, when he asked one of the participants whether they knew what a second was, and how do we know how long a second is. And I think it's quite right. A lot of these we know that maybe time is independent of the observer, but then how we measure time, how we construct the units by which we measure time, again, might well be a construct. So the idea of this trialogue is to bring together three people from various disciplines. It's slightly tilted towards the humanities area, but to bring in three people from different disciplines to think about what time actually means between being objectively measurable and socially constructed, and so we are happy really to have this brilliant trio of speakers. Steve has already said a lot about them. I can't add a lot more. I want to be maybe a bit more formal by saying that Lawrence Eves is a professor of physics at Nottingham University. Jutta Vincent is a senior lecturer for contemporary and modern and contemporary art and visual culture at the University of Birmingham, and she's also a fellow at the Max Weber Kolleg at the University of Erfurt. So greetings to Erfurt, where I spent 10 very good years. And then finally, we've got Megan Sullivan, professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and also, and that is one of the many things that make it interesting for us, also director of the IAS there. And I hope that there will be a lot of talk, hopefully has been going on and will be going on in the future between Marsha and yourself, Megan. As it happens, and quite fitting for a discussion on time, Lawrence Eves, who we had scheduled to go first, is having a time problem. He's stuck in traffic. He will be, I hear, 45 minutes late. So our timing has been thrown into some kind of disarray, but we will obviously move on, and we'll just change the order. We'll start with Jutta. Brilliant, there you are. Then have Megan's paper, and we will put Lawrence at the end. And again, just to give a bit of an idea of the time frame, papers should be around 20 minutes. We would have a 10-minute round of discussions, hopefully answering questions immediately to the paper, but then also as we move on and we learn more about time, hopefully even in the first 10 or so minutes, we can start, comparing the different angles, and then we want to take about half an hour for a concluding discussion to see to what extent, hopefully they all do, but to what extent the papers speak to each other and what we can learn about time between being, as we said, objectively there, independent of the observer, and also being socially, culturally constructed. With this, I hand over to Jutta. I think you had a PowerPoint, and I don't know, I think, yeah, Marsha will have set you up, I hope, so that you can run the PowerPoint and be in control of the paper. So we're all ears now, and we thank you again for just being here and sharing your thoughts with us. And now the floor is over to you. And I'll mute myself.
Jutta, are you muted?
Yeah, I'm just having unmuted myself. So many thanks for this lovely introduction, and also for inviting me to give a paper on conceptions of the present time in art history. I'm just wondering, can you hear me? And can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Is that okay?
You're clear and we can see
I'm
you.
sorry to everyone else who has sick letters.
Wait, I just put on my microphone, so.
Yeah.
So everything should be fine now as we tried it out, yeah? Or is that all right? Yeah, I'm seeing Marsha nodding, so I assume yes.
Yes.
Lovely. And you also see the PowerPoint, because an art historian without having slides is somehow just half of it, so to speak. Yes, let me talk about conception of the present time in art history. This paper will explore concepts of the present time, arguing that modern understandings of temporality have affinities with those of the Middle Ages in the Western world, and I stress in the Western world, especially after the discussion we had from after the 1 p.m. Performance. At the Middle Ages, in the Western world, when time was not understood as a series of moments in the Middle Ages, but as a presence, as being in the present now. It also means that this paper takes a philosophical approach to art history and performance art in particular, a medium or genre which I will interpret in light of conceptions of art, of conceptions of time, sorry. This area of research is the outcome of my association with the Max Weber Center and the Spatio-Temporality Research Group at the University of Erfurt, and a medieval town in the middle of Germany, where the philosopher and theologian Eckhart spent most of his time. Therefore, there is a particular interest in him. And I'm just trying to get further. Lovely, excellent. There's a particular interest in him in Erfurt. Which also led to the opportunity to create an exhibition of works by the contemporary performance artist Terry Kim. And you can see the poster of the exhibition here in the middle. And her work was shown alongside medieval manuscripts associated with Eckhart in the local contemporary gallery in 2016, an exhibition which also traveled to Seoul in South Korea. The exhibition was accompanied by a conference whose papers are published in a co-edited book entitled Performing Bodies, Time and Space in Meister Eckhart and Terry Kim. And you can see here on the left-hand side. Do you see my cursor? I hope so. You can see on the left-hand side of the slide where you can also buy the book. And on the right-hand side, the call for the workshop in 2016. It is my article in this book that has prompted this paper on concepts of the present time, which usually forms part of the triangle of past, present and future. And I would like to start usually. The virtual performance An Hour by the artist Alison Ballard and Martin Lewis, staged by this institute at 1 p.m. today, shows how relevant time is for performance art, both as a topic and as an experience, as well as a reflection for the viewer, as well as actually the performer. Those who have seen it might be reminded of some thoughts mentioned in the following paper. Also, Zoom performances bring in a new set of questions. So, what actually is the present time? How do we conceive of the now? And what does the present have to do with presence as a physical or spiritual, in inverted commas, presentation of something? Conventionally, art is seen as representing reality. However, what about a medium or genre such as performance and body art? Can such genre categories conventionally associated with the 20th and 21st centuries, such as performance art and body art, have anything to do with the Middle Ages, and in particular with the medieval theologian and philosopher Meister Eckhart? Too much seem to be at odds. Having researched and looked closely, one can discover similar themes, and this is not only because artists have set out consciously to interpret Eckhart, but also because it has been argued convincingly that Eckhart foreshadowed some of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's thoughts on corporality, which in turn Amelia Jones related to performance and body art. She, however, does not mention the Middle Ages, nor has any literature on artists and Meister Eckhart discussed performance art before. Therefore, the aforementioned edited book, published in 2016, was the first attempt to bring performance art and Eckhart together. Merleau-Ponty, Kant, and others have related philosophical conceptions of the body to spatio-temporal ideas. Kant by a defining of space and time as a priori categories, and Merleau-Ponty by considering space and time within the body. This means that one could argue that how one conceives of the body is ingrained in how one comprehends of space and time, two concepts closely related to each other. This paper explores performance art to understand better two very different conceptions of the present time. These are just one, there are several more. One which is conceives of the present as a series of moments developed particularly by Bergson as an idea, and another one that illustrates bodily presence, a concept that has been related to Merleau-Ponty. So it's about the moments on the one side, or the present as consideration of a series of moments, or actually the present, the presence. This paper will therefore first examine time and the body in performance art, and then relate it to conceptions of Meister Eckhart, or Eckhart as he's called. A comparison between Meister Eckhart and performance art is not meant in the sense of discovering influences, but rather as two moments in history in which to determine relational understandings. Such approach has been applied by Susanna Birnow, who has dealt with issues of the embodied vision in Maurice Merleau-Ponty and medieval visual theory. Referring to Roger Bacon and St. Francis, she discovered a relational understanding of vision, embodiment, and subjectivity, a theme which also supports the argument of this essay, namely that theories of body underpinning performance art can be related to those in Eckhart's writing. The concept of present time is most significantly illustrated by Marina Abramovich's The Artist is Present, a performance of 2010 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I'm showing you here a still, but you can also watch actually the entire video on YouTube. Reenacted at the Museum of Modern Art in 2010, it reveals the live act of performance art in its title. The title referred to the fact that during the entire performance, the artist, and I quote, the artist would be right there in the gallery or the museum. And you can see her here in the middle, sitting here, and the other visitors around it. During the 736 hours and 30 minutes, the length of the entire performance, the artist sat immobile in the museum's atrium, while spectators were invited to take turns sitting opposite of her, as you can see here, someone sitting there. Visitors waiting in line were invited to sit individually across from the artist, while she maintained eye contact with them. Most visitors sat with the artist for 5 minutes. They were asked not to touch or speak to the artist. This performance highlights the present time in a bodily presence. It is Amelia Jones who explores this piece and other works in view of Merleau-Ponty as the philosopher for whom body, space and time are core themes. In contrast to the Cartesian cogito, Merleau-Ponty describes the body, understood as flesh, as the point of intermediation and thus as the primary site of knowing the world. For him, time is not an extract of the mind, kind of mental abstraction. Instead, time and space that surrounds us is the result of our bodily being in the world. Because we are body, we have space. That's what Merleau-Ponty thinks. Merleau-Ponty was led to recognize that one's own body is not only a thing, a potential object of study for science, but is also a permanent condition of experience, a constituent of the perceptual openness to the world. He therefore underlines the fact that there is an inherence of consciousness and of the body, of which the analysis of perception should take account. The primacy of perception signifies a primacy of experience, so to speak, insofar as perception becomes an active and constitutive dimension. Merleau-Ponty stands therefore in contrast with the Descartian dualist ontology of mind and body. In the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty's most well-known book, Merleau-Ponty writes, and I cite, "Insofar as I have hands, feet, a body, I sustain around me intentions which are not dependent on my decisions and which affect my surroundings in a way that I do not choose." Referring to Merleau-Ponty, Jones speaks of a kind of re-embodying the subject by the act of making and viewing art. And she argues also in light of what you're seeing in front of you of the performance by Marina Abramovic. Jones argues that the performative self, whose meaning and significance is not inherent or transcendent, but derived from the whole scene of his action or her action, dramatically overturns the Cartesian self of modernism, which construes the body not as enacting the self, but as a brute object or hollow vessel given meaning only through the animating force of the consciousness that presumably can thus transcend it. The lived body, Merleau-Ponty observed in his 1945 Phenomenology of Perception, is not discrete from the mind as vessel, but is, in fact, the expressive space by which we experience the world. End of quotation by Jones. Indeed, we do not stand beside space or time or see body as something additional called space to which the body is added. Likewise, we do not stand outside time, but because we have body, we have time. And according to Merleau-Ponty, we have space and time because we are body, and not because our mind conceptualizes it or reflects on it. Abramovic's life act illustrates such an understanding of Merleau-Ponty. Because of her sitting there for hours, she represents the present time as bodily experience. She further draws awareness to the viewer's bodily experience who sits opposite of her without any time frame. Such bodily presence is not only expressed by Abramovich, but also by performance art as such, a genre that grew out of the 1916 happenings and movements. The exhibition aforementioned, that was organized and co-curated in Erfurt, showcased the work of Terry Kim, an American-Korean artist who refers directly and indirectly to Meister Eckhart in his conceptions of time and space in her performances and video installations. So far, She has been the only artist to refer to Eckhart and work in new media rather than what usually artists do, refer to Eckhart in paintings and sculptures. I Breathe, one of Kim's earliest pieces, consists of the artist breathing in the same rhythm as the ticking of the mechanical measurements of time, for which she uses a metronome in I Breathe number 1, the ticking of a clock in Breathe number 2, which here, without representing it, number 2 without actually representing the clock, and then a clock indicating the days of the month, minutes and seconds in her Breathe number 3. To signpost that her focus lies in the measuring of time mechanically and not in the instrument as such. Apart from the types of time measuring devices, the 3 versions differ in showing only the clock, only her face in front of a glass that captures her breathing, as you can see here, visually, and capturing both her bust length appearance facing sideways towards the ticking instrument and the instrument itself in Breathe number 1. In all 3 versions, the breathing and the ticking get out of hand, as the artist cannot keep up. The moments of stopping to catch her breath in order to be able to continue again become more frequent until she nearly faints, an event accentuated visually in Breathe number 2, in which one can see only her face. Soon after this, the video sequence breaks up rapidly. In other words, in this work, Kim embodies time. Indeed, her body becomes time through the movement of the ticking clock, and space, because since Merleau-Ponty notes, because of body there is space. Indeed, the series I Breathe, in particular, is reminiscent of a piece by Abramovich. Together with Ulay, another artist, she performed Breathing In, Breathing Out in 1977, a work in which they connected their mouths, taking each other's breath until they had used up all of the available oxygen. It took 70 minutes before both fell to the floor unconscious. While Kim's work also uses breath as the medium to demonstrate the limits of the body regarding mechanically measured time, breathing in and out makes the point in view of an individual who can absorb the life of another person to the point that each actually destroy the other. Both performances display a suffering inflicted by the artist's body. It is a build-up of exhaustion and over-oxidization, especially here. Unlike the performance by Abramovich and Ulay, Kim's performance is about her understanding of the disjunctions of measured time outside the body and bodily rhythm. As soon as her breathing follows the same rhythm as a scientifically measured time, and here I'm showing you the metronome, as soon as her breathing follows the same rhythm as a scientifically measured time, whether by a clock or metronome, she starts fainting and the performance stops. Performance art does not only consist of live acts. As demonstrated here by showing you stills of the live act, performance art is documented either as videos or in photographs, or actually stills as I'm doing it here. This documentation has received much criticism, for it asks the questions as to extent such documentation is still performance art, if performance art is understood as a live act. Unlike live acts, which seemingly present and are present, videos and photographs do represent a bodily presence. Indeed, stills and photographs of performances in particular draw awareness to a concept of time different from that of a bodily presence, namely to one that foregrounds the division of time. The difference between the two concepts is phenomenological. It seems that as soon as I start thinking, I divide the time into moments, into a past and a future. Bodily presence does not involve a reflection. It is simply a Heideggerian or Merleau-Pontian being, rather than a Cartesian, as he has called it, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And performance art is making use of the being, rather than accepting a body-mind duality introduced by Descartes in mid-17th century and usually associated with the beginning of modernity. Having shown a concept of presence that is different from that of a division of the time into a series of moments, because it attempts to overcome a Cartesian body-mind duality, it becomes clearer why life act of performance art may well represent an association to the time before Descartes, in particular to the 13th century philosopher Eckhart. While none has connected performance art with Eckhart yet, others have related Eckhart and Merleau-Ponty, who critiqued Descartes' duality. Brent Robbins, in particular, has argued that Eckhart foreshadowed Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological understanding that the lived world is lived in a pre-reflected manner that goes before knowing, as this is understood as reflecting understanding. Other scholars have concentrated on the understanding of the present time by Eckhart and argued that Eckhart conceives of it as being able to be bodily perceived. Marmite refers to Eckhart's understanding of God as actus purus, that he calls actualis. Terry Kim, who also, the artist that also is a performer and a performance artist, also wrote a thesis on Eckhart's work, emphasizing Eckhart's concept of nunc, that means the here and now. An interview with Nicolas Laguier begins with a reference to performance mentioned in Eckhart's German sermon of 108. And I quote from the sermon: "We perform here in the time of the one who has been eternally born and who God the Father had born and bears unceasingly in eternity, that the same one who has been born is now being born in time in human nature." So it actually in that sermon, it actually, what Eckhart does is actually to say that eternity is not beyond something else, but it's actually now being born in time in human nature. Nicolas Laguier interprets Eckhart's performance as a, and I quote from him, timeless continuity, an internal self-communication of the divine. At the same time, it expresses itself in all acts that are performed without Eigenschaft, that means without intention and reflexivity, without instrumental goal, and without a good that we are trying to enact. For Laguier, everything Eckhart thinks is intimately linked to a world of practice and performance. He stresses in particular that Eckhart is not to be understood in terms of Gnostic flights, as he is usually seen, also in terms of being a mystic, but actually as someone who affirms of temporality, materiality, and corporality. Hence, while there may well be many differences between Eckhart and performance art, there is one similarity, namely the conceptions of time as bodily presence and as performance written into the life act of performance art seem to be close to Eckhart's conception of time as a continuously bodily presence. This is an understanding of presence different from modern conceptions of time as a series of moments that form time. It is also different from medieval thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, who conceives of eternity as something beyond the now, whereas for Eckhart there is no eternity beyond, but it's all in the now. So to conclude, presence as a bodily experience rather than a series of moments seem to be two possibilities of how to think about the present time, the now. While the latter, the present time, the now, is the product, while the former, while the one that thinks actually, while the former, the series of moments, yeah, is the product of modernity, the one that thinks of the present time as the now, as the bodily experience, the present, yeah, can be associated with thinkers of the Middle Ages and of the mid-20th century, such as Merleau-Ponty, as well as the beginning of the 20th century with Heidegger. Therefore, these two conceptions of time underpin the idea of a modernity that found its ending in the 20th century, an idea not accepted by all. Performance art not only illustrates clearly the different understandings of these concepts, but also disrupts the distinction, particularly those works that use time as a topic. Indeed, performance art is closely interlinked with concepts of time and offers, as I would say and suggest, an ideal medium to bodily experience and to reflect on time. Many thanks for your for listening to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jutta. And in a way, I think we were lucky that you went first. So thank you. We were lucky you went first because this is a really nice connection from
Absolutely, yeah.
our performance earlier on to the more kind of academic debate on what constitutes time. We're slightly over, but I think we should reserve 8 to 10 minutes for immediate reactions to Jutta's paper. So if you have questions, then either you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask, or you can type them into the chat. We've got Ariana here who is monitoring the chat, and she will feed any questions that come over the chat to me. That's the idea. So over to you. We've got Rachel here. Rachel, please.
Thank you. For some reason, I can't raise my hand, so I just thought I'd do it physically. And thank you to Jutta as well. It's a really interesting paper. And I'm interested, and maybe this is a mean question to ask, because you did emphasize at the very beginning you're dealing with kind of Western time. I'm just thinking that even thinking about it in terms of a phenomenological experience of time and a bodily experience of time, it's still a linear conception, perhaps, in that it's a series of moments and a linear evolution of the body, rather than kind of seeing the body in sort of a cycle of time. So a more sort of cyclic development of the body and of time and that kind of thing. So I mean, this is just sort of a bit of a blurb here, but I'm just wondering if you might want to speak a little bit more to these notions of linear time and cyclical time, and where the body is positioned in those concepts.
Many thanks for your question. And cyclical time is obviously also something that one might compare as a topic that happens in the Middle Ages, because cyclical time is something that how time was conceived by many actually in the Middle Ages, not like we have the linear time. To be honest, the one thing I cut, and also I was 5 minutes over, I have to say I cut actually that what I wanted to present as well is not the cyclical time that I would compare it with, but rather as a kind of approach which I favor is actually a network approach, where I think that it's not a cycle where it comes back, because I think the problem for me would be that there were differences between the Middle Ages and now. I mean, for certain, but the moments, and therefore moments not understood actually as two aspects, yeah, that one can compare from such a diverse period of times that usually it's right. I mean, it seems radical to put them together, is actually trying to deconstruct this linear approach. It tries to make a connection, yeah, via an aspect, so to speak. But what I say, I would suggest rather the kind of vision of a network, or in terms of network theories, where you have aspects to compare, where it's exactly not linear, where you follow, so to speak, as I would say, a kind of line between, yeah, and you make also connections to Merleau-Ponty, but it doesn't really matter, yeah, whether it comes afterwards or not, yeah. This is not in the foreground. Obviously, Merleau-Ponty has lived after Eckhart, and we also live after Merleau-Ponty and so on, yeah. Terry Kim is still alive, but what I'm saying is it's about the aspects that can be compared. And this is something which centrally I would very much like to favor, and would also invite, yeah, to make, to apply, to so to speak, look for aspects like the cyclical conception of time, possibly, and to show in which way this has been used, or used in a different way, to sharpen how we think of life, just to get away from that linear one. But what I say, I would rather favor this kind of network approach. I have just published a book on networks approaches also for art history, but yeah, so yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you. In the interest of getting things done in the little time space that we are allowed, can I ask to keep both questions and answers as brief as they can possibly be? Are there further questions? Alex has one.
I would like to ask this thing, that you're saying that in Meister Eckhart's approach, the time was reduced to the now. But in principle, in many cases, now depends on the whole history. It is not just something dependent on what happened right before now. And so the whole history before influences everything that comes after. So is there anything you could say about this in this kind of description you mentioned?
I'm not sure whether I understood the question correctly, and it's certainly something one needs probably to think about more. But in terms of the Nunc by Eckhart, Nunc really means that you experience it now, you bodily experience like we are sitting here. I mean, this is another example one can say. You don't think of it like what happened before and what happened after. And I would also think this is not something that excludes itself. It's a different kind of perspective, a phenomenological perspective. We can switch actually by mind. I can talk about what happened before and what might happen in the future when we have all finished listening to all the papers, yeah. But this is different from experiencing it now, in the presence of talking, and it's very difficult because it's not this reflective then. So the example that Eckhart brings, I'm sure he has also been thinking in these two perspectives, but his concept of eternity, which was obviously very important for the Middle Ages, was not, and that's so exceptional, and that's also why Eckhart actually had the trial, you know, and was persecuted actually by the Roman Church. Was that he thought, for example, eternity, which was obviously difficult, a very important concept at the time, is not beyond. It means it's really in the now. It's like the artist who sits there and emerges. That's probably also a good way to say, emerges in the kind of presence. It's you experience, for him that was God, you experience, yeah, everything in the now. And I don't know whether you understand. I mean, I found it very interesting, the comments after the performance that we just saw at 1 p.m, where we should probably share how, I don't know whether you experience it in the same way, but I can differentiate very clearly, yeah, of this kind of reflective approach and of the past, present and future, and switch immediately also in this kind of trying at least to be in the present, which is very difficult when you look at one hour and apparently also perform 1 hour what we have seen before. Yeah.
Thank you.
And this network approach would also just also to let you, and that's very important to me, would you also make you links to different cultures, by the way, how they conceive of time. If, yeah, because time is so substantial that I think, and I would probably, that time is a concept that in some ways is probably experienced and occurs in any kind of culture. but in different ways. And whether it's called time, it's certainly not called time in German. Yeah.
Yeah, again, thanks to both to Alex for the question and Jutta for the answer. I think in the interest of timekeeping, we should move on now. And so far as I've been informed, Lawrence would be happy to go next. I hope that's okay with you, Megan. You will be restored to your rightful place and have a bit more time to wake up, if that's okay. And so we'll have Lawrence's talk then next, and we're really looking forward to that. Floor is yours.
Oh, good afternoon. First of all, may I apologize for my lateness. I'm not really very good at Zoom. My Zoom never seems to work regularly at home, where I'm working most of the time these days. So my colleague Mark Greenaway has kindly volunteered that we would come down to Loughborough, where we should have a very secure communication. And but unfortunately, time worked against us. We were delayed by 45 minutes with a terrible traffic jam. I thought actually we were there for hours, but we eventually arrived at around about 2:40. So I do apologize for that. Time. Well, my bit is as a scientist and a physicist. What can one say about time? Well, we spend time, we find time, we use time, we pass time, we waste time, we look for time, we lose time, we gain time, we keep time, we race against time, we have a good time, bad time, precious time, short time, long time, etc., etc. There's so many different things for time. So it covers so many things. The theme of my talk and the title of my talk, I owe that to one of my favorite paintings. That's Nicolas Poussin's Dance to the Music of Time, and also to a series of 12 books of the same title by the English novelist Anthony Powell, which I've read many, many times over. He really gives a wonderful account of life in the 20th century, from just after the First World War up into the 1970s, when I finished my studies. So just to start off then, I'd like to show my favorite painting. This is Poussin's painting, and as you can see, there's a dance. It's the dance to the music of time, where you get four figures facing outwards, going around in a circle, this idea of going around in a cycle, to the music of a winged greybeard on the right-hand side, who's playing his harp. And then there are these two baby-like figures. I believe the technical term for them is putti. One of them on the left is playing a flute and accompanying the greybeard, and the one on the right has his timepiece, which involves the sands of time. It's an hourglass, as you can see. He's holding it in his right hand, and the hourglass is indicating time passing. The other interesting feature on the left, there's a statue on the left, which I think must be Janus, the god of time, who could face backward in time and forward in time. And I think that's another nice note. I mean, the painting is not just got these interesting features. There'll be many more features in there that I don't know about, but it's just the beauty in which the colors are presented, and the background, and these heavenly looking figures riding on a chariot or following a chariot up in the clouds. I think it's just a very, very, very beautiful painting. So I wanted to introduce that. Similarly, if I remember correctly, Poussin painted in the mid-17th century. This next one is a tiled floor from late Roman times up in Ravenna, where again you can see the dance taking place and the music. You can see a flautist in the top right. The person on the right-hand side is almost blotted out. Somebody had obviously stolen the tesserae from this floor. These tiny little tiles are called tesserae. But the other interesting thing is, you may wonder what those little dark areas are under each figure. Well, apparently this was commonly used by Romans when they were depicting art and putting their floor and murals up, is to depict shadows, apparently. It's something I didn't know until recently. Now, if I could just turn quickly to a couple of other of my favorite, I actually have a print of this over my bed at home. This is Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia, and I've selected that one because it again portrays time. We can see the melancholy angel. I think it's a female angel, if angels can be male and female. I think they probably can be. Who has got all the accoutrements of science around her. She has a sphere. She's holding a protractor in her hands. And she's got a magic number square up on the top right-hand corner. And you can see this is the first 16 digits, 1 to 16. And I'd like to invite you now as quickly as possible to add those up in your head. It's a very simple formula, so I'll save you the trouble of writing it all out and adding. It's just n into n plus 1 over 2, where n is 16. So you can work out that number, and I'll come back to it later. The painting has got Dürer's date on it. That's somewhere. I think I may have pinched it off a bit from my slide. I can't quite see it at the moment. And it's entitled Melancholia 1. So you can add the 1 there to the sum of the 60 numbers in the figure, and we can talk about that as a joke later on. And then a much more sober and serious print by Dürer is of the night, death, and the devil. It's very, very melodramatic, as you can see. The knight is on a fine-looking horse. It looks as if he's come back from a war where he's probably been in battle and killed some people. And he seems to be heading from left to right and eventually going up into the city up in the hill, peaceful city possibly. But he's being reminded, first of all, just in front of him by death, who again has got an hourglass indicating that time of him, of the night, and indeed of all of us, is limited, and perhaps making us think that we should make the best use of it. And then behind him is a horrible looking, rather, in a sense, so horrible that it's rather amusing, of the devil stalking behind. And the knight is accompanied by presumably his faithful old dog. And presumably the dog is also heading up to the city where he might have a bowl of food to eat. So I think that's another dramatic depiction of the Renaissance view of time and how it passes, and the use of the hourglass to portray it. And also to indicate, in the case of the, whereas in the case of the Poussin, you had a cycle of time, here we see time progressing in one direction and reminding us that the amount of time we have on Earth is fairly limited. I'll pass quickly over the next one. This is the Mad Hatter's Tea Party from Lewis Carroll. And I think I read bits of this book when I was a small boy, but I was much more interested in other things then, like astronomy and fiddling around with fireworks. But I do remember having to read parts of it at school for some obscure reason. And that, of course, spends a lot of time discussing time. Lewis Carroll, the writer, was a mathematician at one of the colleges I was a junior fellow at, Christ Church in Oxford, and he taught mathematics and philosophy, and in his spare time, he wrote the book about Alice, and Alice, of course, as probably you know, was the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church at that time. So I haven't got time, I don't really understand, well, the concept of time is done by means of a series of jokes, really, in Alice in Wonderland. And I ought to read it again one time, and maybe you know much more about it than I do. And then going back to my time as a child, I was at a very good grammar school in the Rhondda Valley. I was very lucky. We had brilliant maths and physics and chemistry teachers there. And every morning at 9 o'clock, we had to go for assembly and sing a hymn. And half of the hymns, 2 days a week or 2 or 3 days a week, the hymns were in Welsh, which was a language I never really understood, although I was brought up in Wales from birth. This is one of the songs we sang. Time like an ever-rolling stream bears all its sons away. They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day. I think this is rather typical of the sort of nonconformist church of the Methodism in particular in the 18th century. But again, this has the concept of time now being a stream that rolls on forever. And I'd bring this back into my discussion of some scientific concepts in a moment. Right, let's get down to the science now. I just want to ask Mark, can you see all of the formulae there? That's not obscured, is it? But no, you can see all the formulae. So I just want to go through everyday common or garden units of time. Now, I believe, although this is a little bit controversial, I think there's a view that the second represents the time of a heartbeat. So we're all carrying, if we're all healthy and sitting comfortably in a chair, then and we just have to put our fingers on the pulse. Each pulse is about 1 second long, so it's a heartbeat. Now minutes, there are 60 seconds in a minute, and 60 is also quite an interesting number because it's also 60 minutes in the hour. This concept of hours and minutes is thought of to date back to the ancient Egyptians, who liked making sundials, and they used to like to sort of mark out small intervals of time on their sundials. And the unit 60 for 60 minutes in an hour, it was possible to scribe out 60 little grooves, if you like, in the sundial to show the 60 minutes of an hour. But it's also interesting that there's 60 minutes an hour and 60 seconds in a day. I think the other reason for this is 60 is a very useful number because, of course, we can divide it by 2, 3, 5, 10, 12, and that's the lot, I think. So it's a very handy thing. So if you've got lots of flour or something, or loaves of bread that's being produced, you can divide. 60 is easily divisible between families or large groups of people. Now, what is a day? Well, we need to do a little bit of astronomy here. On the left-hand side, I've shown you the big blue circle in the middle. Let's consider that to be the big, relatively large planet, the Earth. And then orbiting around that is a smaller satellite, our moon, labeled M. And that moon is held in orbit, of course, by a gravitational force. The bigger the mass, the Earth has got a reasonable mass, but the bigger the central object, the bigger that is, then that's one factor for determining the time it takes for the planet to make the cycle. The other important factor is the distance from the heavy object and the orbiting object. Now, for the case of the Earth-Moon orbit, the moon is orbiting around in 1 month, and that's where the month comes from. And of course, that's been affecting life on Earth right from the very time of very, very simple multicellular animals appeared. They were almost certainly conscious of day and night. So that had an influence on life on Earth and evolution and so on. Now, the formula I've written on the left-hand side, the period, the time taken to go around one full cycle, that comes from Kepler's law, third law of planetary motions and so on. And that preceded Isaac Newton's laws by about 50 years. So Kepler was a giant. We can also use the formula if we replace the central blue object, the Earth, by the sun, and then have the small object labeled M, change that to the Earth, and that then gives us, we can use Kepler's formula to describe the time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun, and that takes 1 year. That you can get from the mass of the sun and from the distance r of the Earth from the sun. So those are very natural units. It's interesting to note, of course, that these are by no means constant, due largely to the effect of waves on the oceans. We have big oceans on Earth, and the waves are going. We've got tidal waves in the tides and so on. That introduces friction, and so the orbit of the moon, time it takes for the moon to go once around the Earth, is getting longer, and the moon is moving further from the Earth. So that's an interesting feature. So 1 day is getting longer all the time, and of course it's not exactly 365 days. Of course, it's 365 and a bit, which is why we have leap years. Now, those are very sort of anthropic, if you like, human time intervals. If you're a scientist, it's a much more natural interval of time, which is much, much, much shorter. It's the so-called Planck time. And this we can get without any dials and so on. We just put together three fundamental constants in the right way to produce a unit of time. And those three constants are h bar, which is under the square root sign. That's the quantum, that's the number that underpins all of quantum mechanics. Big G is the gravitational constant that determines the force of gravity between two objects. And in the denominator, the c to the power fifth, c is the speed of light. If we combine all those things together and take the square root of it, lo and behold, we have a unit of time. We can describe that in seconds, but it's just a bit less than 10 to the minus 43 seconds. That's 1 divided by 1 with 43 zeros after it. It's a very, very fast unit of time. But it's very important and very fundamental, and it crops up all the time when we're looking at, in astronomy and astrophysics, the lifetime of a star, for example, is related closely to the Planck time. Now, let's go back now, and I talked about Janus. Janus could look forward in time and look back in time. Unfortunately, we can only look back in time, and it's difficult for us to move forward, to look forward in time. But we can look back in time, as I'll show you now. This is a deep sky image from the Hubble telescope, and it's showing a group of a large area of galaxies. A huge telescope took this with some fantastic photodetectors. And this is showing a lot of the little blobs in there you can see. For example, on the left-hand side, you've got something that looks a bit like a spiral galaxy. And then I think there's another spiral galaxy right at the bottom you can see clearly. Some of those galaxies were formed 13.2 billion years ago. Now, the Big Bang that started it all off was 13.7 billion years ago. So these galaxies were around just 500 million years or so. They'd already formed after the Big Bang. This is a remarkable thing. And we're looking back there in time. We can look back in time into the past, but nearly the start of our universe. Okay, next slide. Now, so what do we, I'm nearly at the end now. So what do we conclude? How much time do I have left? A few minutes? 1 minute, 2 minutes?
Yeah, 3-4 minutes.
Oh,
3-4
fine.
minutes.
Okay, good. So let me just go back to the Big Bang. Before the Big Bang theory only came up really, I mean, people have thought about it before, but prior to that in the 50s and 60s, there were three very famous astronomers called Bondi and Gold and Hoyle, who had a steady state picture of the universe. They argued that the universe was always there in the past, and yes, galaxies were receding away from our galaxy, all galaxies were receding from each other, but somehow matter was created spontaneously and generated all the time to keep the density of matter and galaxies and so on in the sky roughly constant. This was called the steady state theory. Now, that was eventually blown apart when the microwave background radiation, this very weak far infrared radiation, was discovered back in the 60s by Penzias and Wilson. And that demonstrated fairly convincingly that the continuous creation model of Hoyle and his friends wasn't correct, and that there was a sudden explosion about 13.6 billion years. Somehow matter was generated initially in the way of electromagnetic light, really, and then matter condensed out, and eventually galaxies and stars and planets were condensed out. So that's the Big Bang theory. So there, the idea of time rolling on infinitely from the past and infinitely into the future is changed. According to the Big Bang model, time started and will continue, and the universe will expand until we see fewer and fewer galaxies because they're all receding away from us. We simply won't be able to see them any longer. However, there's another theory that's was developed several years ago by a British Nobel Prize winner, Roger Penrose, and he didn't like this model because if you've got this, he's showing here a Big Bang, and you can see these little cone-shaped objects if we look at one of those cone-shaped objects, he's got Big Bang, and then he's got this thing expanding out to give us, as time continues, and the galaxies just dilute out, so they get further and further apart. And his idea is that eventually this process will go on for a very long time, but eventually, due to the force of gravity, black holes will form. And the idea is that black holes will eventually evaporate away into light. This is called Hawking radiation. And so eventually the universe will end up as a bunch of photons. And he came up with this wonderful but slightly crazy idea. I'm skeptical, but I think it's a great idea. He's come up with this idea of a conformal universe where you have a Big Bang, the universe expands, all the matter eventually decays away into electromagnetic radiation, into long wavelength light waves. And once you've got just light waves just go at the speed of light. They're not like protons or electrons or planets or galaxies. They don't have any mass. And if you don't really have any mass, you can't define time. So he's got this idea then that when this universe is expanded, when this cone is expanded, at some point where there's only radiation left, this thing basically looks like the start of the Big Bang, where we only had radiation. And so you can get rid of, although this thing looks big, we can conformally compress it back down into something that looks like a piece of bamboo, where we've got these cyclical processes. So after each Big Bang, the universe expands, everything dilutes away, all we got left are photons, and then we can somehow compress that back to almost to a singularity and start it all over again. If you don't believe me, there are some wonderful, I'm not sure I believe it either, but there are some wonderful lectures on this on YouTube, which you can enjoy. And Penrose is certainly a brilliant guy. And in some ways, his model, I think, is better than other ones that have come along, things like multiverse models, which I'm very skeptical about. So this is a very exciting time for cosmologists. Now, just to give you an idea about time, this is just some equations about how long it takes a black hole to form. How long can a black hole live? Well, a black hole, it can grow and grow and grow. It's one at the center of our galaxy, and it's always sucking in stars and so on, and getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And eventually it will become a supermassive black hole and will have gobbled up nearly all the stars and planets in our galaxy. And once it's done that, all it can do is sit there, grabbing what it can through its powerful force of gravity, but also it just emits radiation, very tiny, tiny amounts. And eventually a black hole will eventually evaporate away into electromagnetic waves, into infrared light. And for a typical supermassive black hole, which will eventually grow in our galaxy, that lasts for 10 to the 100 years. Now that's a hell of a long time, of course. So that's an interesting concept. And that's about the longest time scale I think we can envisage. Now, just to finish off, why is our universe expanding? Well, this is a slightly technical formula. This is a formula that Einstein sort of generated, and then Friedman, Robinson, Walker, and Lemaitre, they worked on it, and they could work out the rate at which the universe is accelerating. That's the two little A double dots over A on the left-hand side. And then after that, on the other side of the equation, we've got the attractive force of gravity. There's big G, and rho is the density of the universe on average. And that's slowing down the expansion. But now we know that there's an additional term, the so-called cosmological constant, which Einstein hated. He invented it, but then he thought it didn't exist. And that's what's causing the universe to expand. And that number is extreme. It's not zero, it's extremely small. And the remarkable thing is, we would not be here if G, the gravitational constant, and lambda weren't extremely small. They're balanced absolutely precisely to give us long enough, to give the universe long enough time for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for planets to start forming around stars, and then for life to develop on planets. And we're here today thanks to the smallness of lambda and to the size of G. Now, I just can't resist mentioning one other fine-tuning. This is the electromagnetic fine structure constant, which I've written down as alpha, equals 1 over 137. That's another important thing. We wouldn't exist in the universe if alpha had a slightly different value. And notice it's dimensionless, by the way. It's not in meters per second. It's just a number. It's 1 over 137. And then the other important factor is that is a proton to electron mass ratio. and that's 1836. Now, if you've done your mathematics and go back to Dura and add up all those 16 letters in the word square, you'll get 136. And then if you add 1 to that, because of Melancholia 1, you'll get 137. So I love to tease my colleagues about this, that Dura had invented the fine structure constant in that wonderful piece of work that he did, Melancholia. So I'll finish there. We are all lucky.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think because I do want to have a break, I think we need at least a moment of relaxation. So after properly thanking you, Lawrence, for that wonderful talk, I'll immediately hand over. I think we can take 1-2 questions. Again, Ariana is monitoring the chat. If you want to ask a question verbally, make a sign, wave, raise your hand electronically, and then unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay. Sorry again?
Yes, I just wanted to say that if people had problems in popping a question in the chat before, now they should be able to. So everything is fine with the chat if you want to use it. Thank you.
Good. Everybody happy then? Followed everything?
Sorry, if nobody else has a question, then I have one. I'm curious about this this interplay when you started out from very kind of cultural concepts of time, and then you talked about how a lot of those time units that we use, and in particular the second. I mean, I was aware about a month or year or where they come from. That is, I mean, I'm a historian by training, and that's basically what you learn in the first couple of semesters when you do kind of chronology. But I wasn't really aware about the second, and it intrigues me that because we talked about the body and time in the previous talk, and here we have a unit that is really based on a bodily function, and that goes into, if I understand that correctly, it goes into these formula that you then later on discussed, such as Planck time, for example. Am I getting this right? And would you agree with that? That there is kind of because we started out with this question, and what is a second, and how do we know how long a second is? Do you think there is this where these both kind of natural bodily functions and their kind of cultural, how shall I put it, their cultural appropriation are basically then used to devise these kind of formula that are trying to objectively measure time? Is that an appropriate way of seeing it?
I was glad to be able to give this talk, and I did reflect on it. I'm a great lover of, I haven't had to talk about music. I mean, music, remember, is all about time as well. In fact, the way we speak, the way we communicate with ourselves, long before we had telephones and Zoom and WhatsApp and all that other stuff. I mean, when we speak, if I say pew, mu, q, those sounds, they've all got a certain well-defined frequency or combination of frequencies. And so the inverse of time, which is frequency, is something that is a wonderful property of humanity. It's the way we communicate. Animals communicate with sounds as well, but we perfected it to a much higher level than other animals. And of course, we've got a bonus, which is the wonder of music. Now, I think in a sense, I showed you the idea of Janus. I think as a scientist, I look both ways. I mean, I greatly enjoy, I hate all post-1970s music. I like rock music, but not classical music, which is what I'm really interested in. But I think things went rather wrong in classical music after 1970 or 80. How am I digressing into this? But so you know, there's the music, the art in particular. I think that people like Poussin, Claude Lorraine, and Turner are wonderful oil paintings, and Dürer, fantastic. So on one side of me, there's the love of arts, but there's also then the love of science. And I think there's a big divide between it. For me, my interest in arts and humanities is an amateur interest. My professional interest is science. I should say, by the way, that my colleague sitting next to me here, Mark Greenaway, and we don't work in cosmology. We're interested in it, and it's a hobby. But our main work is we're working on rather mundane things like the next generation of electronic devices. I mean, things like graphene and stuff like that. So I think there's this cultural divide, and this cultural divide has been around for a long time. When I was a boy growing up in the 1950s, another novelist, C.P. Snow, wrote a series of novels about academic life, but he also wrote about this cultural divide called The Two Cultures. On the one hand, you have science, and on the other hand, you have the humanities. And I think there's a huge division between the two. I mean, I went as an undergraduate to Oxford. There were 50 people in my year at Oxford. There were 4 scientists, 2 engineers, 2 mathematicians, and everybody else did classics, history, politics, philosophy, and economics. And there really was a cultural divide. We would talk about philosophy sometimes, but there was a real divide, and it exists I think it exists up to now. I think, you know, when this is a good thing or bad thing, I know not. But it is, I think it's very difficult for people who've not done at least A-level in science or a degree in science to really appreciate the beauty of it. And that everything around us and everything we do, you see it in a much more beautiful way if you're a scientist, in my view. I don't know if that answers your question, but so the minute, the second, the hour is a perfectly human construct. The Planck time is something different. The cosmological constant is 1 upon a square root of, the cosmological constant, if I take a square root and then invert it, that's the time as well. And that's about the age of the universe. And that is a remarkable coincidence. It's very lucky for us because we wouldn't be here if it weren't, but it's a remarkable coincidence. And those things are incredibly beautiful. And I think when you begin to understand them, it totally changes your outlook on life.
Claudia would like to make a comment if possible.
Yes, hello everyone. Interesting talk, Lawrence, thank you. When I saw that you would be speaking, I thought, I bet you're going to be talking about the Planck time in Big Bang. So I'd like to offer a slightly different perspective, and actually not from a physicist background. I'm myself also a physicist, for those who don't know. But from my previous experience of living at the south coast, I used to live in Seaford, East Sussex, or Newhaven, and I used to sometimes walk my dog on the seafront. And you notice in the chalk cliffs the layers of flint. And one thing that becomes apparent is they are at very regular intervals. And I thought, hang on, why is that actually like that? Because there are thousands of years between those sediments that have caused exactly those layers of flint to be deposited. So what mechanism is there to make the same thing happen tens of thousands of years later again? And I then ask some colleagues, luckily the University of Sussex has across the road the University of Brighton with some really smart geologists. And this is something that isn't necessarily well understood, but I think this gives us an idea of timescales and how they come into all of our lives, not just through physics, but through all things. So the current thinking is that what is happening there is that we as physicists know that the Earth's axis precesses, so it basically has a slight wobble in its orbit, and that causes a minute change in the exposure to cosmic radiation. So in other words, more northern lights, that sort of thing. And that in turn affects life on Earth. So some geologists think that this affects the regularity of ice ages and so on. So there are many effects that have a time scale. Also, Lawrence was talking about the frequencies of speech and music and our natural heartbeat, but there are many phenomena in the natural world that have a physics reason, if you like, and have then lots of other consequences.
Thank you for that question. My second slide was to be on precisely this topic, so if I could just dig it out now. Yes, this is taken from a piece of work done by a friend of mine when I was at Berkeley in California back in the 1970s. John Clark was a very distinguished low temperature physicist. This is a plot of so-called 1 upon F noise. The basic idea is that if you're at a busy railway station, for example, or maybe, you know, at lunchtime when the students come out from their lectures, you'll get a wide spectrum of noise, and I mean noise at this point, and it has a certain characteristic. It's got a sort of 1 upon F dependence. So that means a 1 upon F dependence means that if for higher frequencies tend to have fairly high amplitudes, high frequencies of speech or a bit of background music or so on, but then unexpected events, you know, like somebody dropping a suitcase or a door slamming, those are slightly rarer events, and they are happening over a longer period, and those events tend to occur less frequently, but they have a bigger impact, if you like. And this sort of idea of 1 upon F noise, I'll come back to in a moment. But what Voss and Clark did in this view graph, they were interested to plot out radio stations. So at the top, you've got the characteristic straight line, which is the 1 upon F dependence. The horizontal axis, by the way, is the logarithm of 1 upon the frequency. So the high frequency at -3, that's a kilohertz. That's quite a high note on a piano. And the 1 on the right-hand side of the horizontal axis is a period of 10 seconds. So that's, you know, a fairly, that sort of thing, if you could hear that. You can, but you see, if you put channels in, if you put classical music in, that's actually Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 1. And then the one below it B is jazz. Then you've got rock. And then you've got just a news program with people talking. And they all have roughly this dependence. The classical one is pretty close, and the jazz one is not too bad either. Now, the point about this is that's just from the point of view of music. But if we consider the Earth and all the things that happened on the Earth and geological time and so on, then we can note a couple of things. So, for example, Mount St. Helens was a pretty big noise about 20 years ago. And then we have to go back probably to the big meteorite that hit Siberia around about 1910, I think, where that would have been probably been an even bigger noise. It was heard in London all the way across halfway around the world. And then, of course, you could go back to even longer epochs of time when you had the extinction of the dinosaurs, where a really massive meteorite hit the Earth near the Bay of Mexico. And you know, that did a pretty big extinction. And then since then we've had massive eruptions. We had the eruptions in the tracts of India and further north, and they must have been hugely noisy, big events. So the longer we wait in time, the bigger these events. You know, if we're patient, we get a bigger and bigger event occurring. So, for example, when it must have been very, very noisy, not just sonically noisy, but just generally noisy, when the Earth was formed, and when something big hit the Earth and separated off the Moon, for example. The Moon is thought to be formed by a collision of a large object with the Earth. And then maybe the Big Bang was the biggest bang of all. So I think that if we look at geology, I think it's a very complex thing. Yes, I agree there probably are some cyclical things due to long cycles of I don't know much about this, but cycles of the sun. But you know, those things that you see on cliff edges are really dramatic and a wonderful timepieces really of what's happened in ancient times. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's I think it's a generally interesting thing to think about.
Thank you very much. I think because it's already 4, and I do think that we should have a break at least. Kind of.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm zooming in from South Bend, Indiana. It's in the morning for me. It's 11 a.m., but it's also a really big holiday weekend here. So we just celebrated our Thanksgiving holiday yesterday, and today's typically a kind of continuation of that holiday. So I've got to run back home to attend to some family duties as soon as this finishes. So I apologize for that. I'm beaming at you from the offices of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. This year we're doing a theme project as well. Marcia and I talked quite a bit about this summer about how we've been running our programs in light of the challenges that the pandemic is causing, but our project this year is on the nature of trust. And for those of you guys who are interested in these kinds of interdisciplinary thematic projects, I definitely encourage you to check out the NDIS webpage. But in my other life, when I'm not directing the Institute for Advanced Study here, I'm a philosopher who works on time from a couple different dimensions. I trained as a metaphysician, so I trained as a philosopher that thinks about the very abstract and high-level questions about time and reality. Recently, in the last 5 years, moved much more into ethics, and in 2018 wrote a book called Time Biases, which deals with how our assumptions about the nature of the passage of time manifest themselves in our rational planning. So what kinds of assumptions do we make about what it is to be a person with a past and a future when we try to make decisions about very practical matters, like how much money to deposit into a retirement account, or when we consider our bigger, more existential values, like how terrified should we be of the fact that there are points in the future where we don't exist. These are questions that have obviously been part of the bread and butter of philosophy since at least 2,400 years ago, periods in ancient Greece and in Zhou China, when these kinds of metaphysical questions about personhood and time and planning and our duties to others historically and in the present sort of came alive on the human scene, and they're very much live questions in contemporary philosophy. I thought rather than preparing any kind of lecture for you guys this morning, given that I'm kind of the mop-up crew coming number 3 in the sequence, and because you're trying to launch this year of interdisciplinary research rather than to try to close it out with any kind of definitive answers, I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about what philosophers see as their role in these debates about the nature of time, introduce you to one conceptual distinction that is the subject of many philosophy conferences and papers right now and debates about time, and that may have analogs in your own disciplines. Talk a little bit about how philosophers look to other disciplines for evidence for their theories, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that arise out of that. And I'll try to say a couple things that are controversial enough to get you guys thinking. So what do philosophers add to debates about the nature of time? One thing that philosophers try to do is build rigorous and unifying models for really high-level concepts. That's been certainly part of our discipline ever since the ancient Greeks, and that's definitely a view that analytic philosophers in the last 100 years have taken to be part of their professional identity. What do I mean here? Well, in the case of time, we obviously have the concept of time that plays many different roles in our lives. Time is the kind of thing, as Lawrence said, is something that we worry about when we fill out our day planners and we consider whether or not we're living our day-to-day lives well. Time is the kind of subject of physics, and there are certainly models of time that we all depend on that are really closely intertwined with physical discoveries. Even if you don't understand the theory of special relativity in any kind of deep way as a non-physicist, we all use cellular phones that rely on calculations, that rely on the theory of special relativity to make sure those signals come from satellites. So physics has a direct impact in how we live our day-to-day lives. And physical models of time are certainly going to be important to some of our conceptual models of time. Obviously, time plays a really important role in our artistic thinking and our thinking of how we experience really important life events. It's critical to our view about historical thinking and narratives. So one role that philosophers play is seeing all of these different threads in a major concept that governs our lives and trying to figure out to what extent those threads can come together into some kind of unified theory, or whether or not we want to say that time is spoken of in many ways, and that there are just many disparate and ambiguous concepts, and that there is no potential like single unifying thread. And that in and of itself is a philosophical question that people have debated for about 2,000 years. Another thing philosophers, I think, are good at in these debates is once other disciplines have come up with a really high-level question about a subject matter, philosophers are good at making conceptual distinctions that might have been overlooked by people especially involved in gathering experimental evidence. One example of this that comes out, I think, very vividly for me, in my work on time and rationality, read a great deal of social psychology research. And many times the social psychologists will have found a really empirically robust way of testing something. For instance, testing somebody's temporal discount rates. So what kind of slope do they care less and less about events as they're scheduled further and further in the future? That's a major topic of research in social psychology. But sometimes the ways that psychologists are choosing to measure these attitudes about preferences and values are just glossing over really important distinctions in ethics and rationality about what a preference might be. And sometimes they're testing one phenomenon that's not quite the phenomenon that they think they're testing. Philosophers can come in and raise really interesting questions by helping people see distinctions that they might not have been aware of ahead of time. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that in Q&A if you guys are interested. A third area where philosophy is relevant, and this is probably the area where we get ourselves into the most trouble when we're in interdisciplinary contexts, but philosophers, especially philosophers in the Western tradition and analytic philosophers, are very interested in the truth values of various claims. So is some hypothesis true or false, and how strongly is it supported by the evidence? And this gets us into really interesting questions about what constitutes evidence for a really high-level theory. Philosophers can also be involved in these debates in trying to figure out what we don't know about particular questions and what kinds of experiments or logical arguments might be relevant or irrelevant. And this becomes especially important. And the two groups that I interact with most as a philosopher of time are, again, psychologists and physicists. And oftentimes you'll be in interdisciplinary context talking about a phenomenon of mutual interest, and the people in one discipline will be making really grand statements about the philosophical upshots or truth values of their hypotheses, when really the evidence hasn't quite come in yet to support that view. I think these examples come up quite a bit when we're trying to consider whether or not very rigorous models that are coming out of experimental and theoretical work in physics can be translated back into everyday concepts of time. I think it comes out quite a bit that, like, you'll read these really popular books that say, like, this new discovery in string theory proves that, and it almost always proves that time is unreal, or there is no such thing as time. But that doesn't quite land the blow because, I mean, there is such thing as time. I've got an appointment in 40 minutes. So eventually the physical theory needs to explain why I need to go see my family for lunch. And so doing that translational work itself tends to demand a little bit of philosophical theorizing. So that's an area where we tend to be very interested in working with especially psychologists and physicists, but people in all disciplines on trying to better understand time. Two particular debates that I followed quite closely in my career. The first is a debate that philosophers and physicists have been engaged in certainly quite seriously since Einstein published his initial papers on special relativity, but it's perennially a topic that you learn about in analytic philosophy graduate school. And that's what upshots, if any, does the theory of special and general, do the theories of special and general relativity, and to a certain extent theories in quantum mechanics, play in our attempts to discover what it is to theorize a present moment, and whether or not there is such a thing as the present, or there is any sharp distinction between the past and the present and the future. One of the main lessons we get from the theory of special relativity, which is really robustly empirically supported and which we've come to rely on, again, in many practical dimensions of our lives, is that there doesn't seem to be any concept of absolute simultaneity in the theory of special relativity. And that has been philosophically mind-blowing ever since the upshots of these models have been understood by philosophers. Why is that mind-blowing? Well, I mean, you might raise this philosophical question: what kind of thing in the world am I? And where are all of my parts? Is all of Megan Sullivan present right here for this Zoom conference? That's a question, again, that goes back to like Heraclitus. It goes back to the ancient Greeks. But you might think, initial hypothesis that we have about ourselves or objects that we really care about is that they are fully present. They're all gathered here together, and there's no part of me that's not like existing right in this space that is the subject of my experience. But if relativity says that there is no such thing as a present moment, or there's no such thing as parts existing absolutely simultaneously, then that concept of being a unified agent at a moment doesn't seem to hold water anymore. So what are we left with? Do we have to change our pre-theoretical concepts of what it meant to be physically here, or what it meant to be an object with parts that are spread out through time? That's something philosophers have spent quite a bit of time debating, especially in metaphysics. And it has relevance not only to these interesting theoretical questions about what it is to be a person, but also some practical questions. If I start instead to think of myself as an object that is spread out through space and time, with parts that exist in the past, maybe I've got childhood parts that exist in the 1980s or that part of space-time, and I've got retiree parts, pensioner parts that exist very far in my future light cone, and they already exist. Does that mean that I lack free will? That's a question that philosophers would debate quite a bit. If all my parts are spread out in that way, then there doesn't be anything I can do to change their position in space and time. It doesn't seem like I have any meaningful control over my future. Is that the right upshot? If not, do we need to change our conception of freedom? Another really interesting, even more practical question is there's lots of interesting work in social psychology that if you come to think about your future self as somebody that's already existing, that's fully manifest, then you also tend to feel a great deal more sympathy for that future self, and that tends to change how much money you put into retirement accounts or your willingness to go get a preventative medical screening. There's been really interesting work by a psychologist named Hal Hirschfeld at UCLA, where he has people look at aged images of their future selves before they have to make decisions about how much money to deposit into a retirement account. And it turns out if you're able to really vividly imagine your future self existing in reality and see what they might be like as somebody that takes up space, then you're also much more likely to make cross-time trade-offs that benefit that individual. So that's an interesting, like, philosophical carryover question. Obviously, if these future projections are more like fantasy stories that will bear on the question of whether or not Hal's research is a rational way for your banker to deal with you. If it turns out that, in fact, we really are beings that don't have any particularly robust present moment, then probably a lot of the ways in which we seem to favor the present over the future don't have any ethical or rational backing. And that is also a very interesting philosophical question. How to tell whether a philosopher is doing a good job or a bad job in these debates? I think it's very important that philosophers be contributing questions that make sense in the other disciplines, at least some of the time, and that help generate new interesting research projects, that help point the way towards evidence that might help to settle these models, or at least get us closer to models for interesting phenomena that we care about. And we all certainly care quite a bit about time. So we should be expecting philosophers, at the very least, to be asking really interesting questions. Building these rigorous, grand, unified models is, obviously, anyone in physics will also tell you, it's very hard, and finding any kind of decisive evidence or any evidence of decisive progress when you're at this level of generality and abstraction is quite difficult. And I think that the results and what we count as success in philosophical research are the questions that philosophers are asking, generative and unifying, and not are we settling once and for all what the true nature of time is or what we really care about when we care about the present. That's not to say that there aren't truths that we can know about these questions. I think a great deal of philosophers believe that there are objective truths about these physical phenomena and moral and rational phenomena. But it might be that the evidence at this level is just so difficult to gather that the best we can do is keep proposing interesting models and then those leading to further investigation. Another thing I think that philosophers do a good job at is offering methodological guidance and caution. Also for the last 2,000 years, philosophers have been in the business of trying to understand how difficult it is to grasp the truth about some of these large questions. And so if we tend to try to extract these really grand theories quite quickly from like a very recent discovery in physics or a very recent, hard to replicate study in social psychology, philosophers are very good at saying, like, calm down, did you realize like 100 years ago we looked at the question differently? Another final area where methodologically I think philosophers have something to contribute to these debates is that many times when we're at this level of abstraction or dealing with high-level concepts, there really aren't clear experiments that we could perform that are going to provide decisive evidence about the truth or falsity of a theory. Sometimes our best evidence for a theory is that it fits logically with the rest of a system that we've been building. Certainly debates about time take their evidence from all of the different areas of our life where we seem to care about the phenomena of time. One thing philosophers can do is build logical arguments that show, like, this package of views might be consistent, but if you add this other assumption, then it's inconsistent. And then, of course, we can have another philosophical debate about whether we care about our views being consistent. But that is another thing that philosophers can contribute, is at least the capacity to, like, logically unify a bunch of different topics and point out areas where we might be talking past each other. So that's my pitch for being interested in philosophy, and my hope is that philosophers can also try to be a bit more interesting to people other than philosophers, which is always a bit of an occupational hazard for our team. To give you guys a sense of a debate topic, at least in analytic philosophy of time, that has been pretty significant the last 30 years. I'll give you a brief distinction, and certainly if you read a lot in analytic philosophy of time, you'll see this distinction coming up again and again. And that's between what we call A theories of time and B theories of time. The A-B distinction we inherit from British philosopher, actually, John MacTaggart, Ellis MacTaggart, a Scottish philosopher who was writing, I believe, like before World War I. It would have been like 1904, probably around the time that Einstein was working. MacTaggart was writing. He was in a more idealist tradition in philosophy, but he wrote a seminal paper that's the subject of much philosophical consternation on the unreality of time, on the idea that our core concepts of time are logically inconsistent. Lots of philosophers debate whether his argument is any good, and the general consensus is it's not that good. But his distinctions were very good, and he made a distinction between what he called the A series of time and the B series of time in that seminal paper. There are lots of ways of trying to recapture in contemporary terms what his distinction is. Here's my favorite version, but I'm just going to flag for you that it's controversial even among philosophers. We face this question: what does it mean to live in a world of change, where change occurs, and change is intimately related to our concepts of time? According to the B theorist camp in philosophy, all change is ultimately reducible or understandable in terms of variation in a spread out space-time manifold. So we can imagine space and time maybe as one single unified entity out in the world. And if we talk about any form of change, we can ultimately accurately redescribe that change by just talking about variation in that spread out manifold. Here's an even more specific, silly example. We can say the United States is about to change presidents. That's a really simple form of change that's going to happen in the next few months. A B theorist would explain that as saying there's a part of the space-time reality, the space-time manifold, that has an episode of the Donald Trump presidency, and then there's a variation in the manifold where there's an episode of a Joseph Biden presidency. And the change in the political system in the United States is explained by the fact that the manifold is Trumpy over here and Biden-y over here. You might also think, what is it for things to come into and out of existence? So I live a temporary life. I'm a temporary existent on this earth. That means that the manifold has a region in it that contains the event that is my life, or contains the spread out object that is Megan Sullivan. But there are other parts of the manifold, indeed significant, possibly infinitely large parts of the manifold, that don't contain me as any relevant part. And that's what it is for me to be a contingent or temporary existent. So B theory, any kind of thing that is an important phenomena of change, is explained as variation in this spread out manifold. The A theories of time are theories of time that say there's at least some forms of real change in the world that cannot be reduced to variation in a manifold. What does that mean? Well, the most extreme forms of the A theory of time are called presentist theories. And presentists believe there's no manifold. Everything that's real is located absolutely simultaneously in a present moment. The past and the future are not real. They don't exist. They haven't occurred. There's no part of the manifold that could represent them. And change is a matter of things changing within this present moment. Obviously, presentism faces one significant challenge, which is making that view seem consistent with special relativity, which doesn't seem to have any kind of meaningful way of establishing what it would be for events to happen absolutely simultaneously. Presentists have a lot to say about how to meet that challenge. There's definitely a closet industry of philosophers writing about how to address that question. I'll kind of set that aside for a moment, because that's not the only way that you can be an a-theorist of time. There are other a-theories of time that believe that there's a manifold, but what it is for time to pass is that there's some other dimension of reality. You can imagine it as like maybe a spotlight that moves across that manifold and like lights things up, giving them the sense of occurring now. Maybe there are multiple spotlights, and that's how we account for relativity. There are versions of the A-theory that think that the past and the present are real. Those are in an important sense captured by a manifold, but the future is not. The future is in an important sense open or undetermined. There are versions of the manifold that think that everything is real, but there's an important sense in which properties change within the manifold. And these are a lot of debates right now among philosophers. It's just how do you even make this distinction between manifold only and manifold plus theories coherent? And that was something that I worked on in my graduate work and have been involved quite a bit in those debates. And again, those tend to involve physicists pretty significantly. Another reason you might care about the A theories and B theories of time, besides just the fact that this might be a useful way of dividing up different general theories of time, is it gets us into these very interesting questions about psychology and rationality. And I'll give you guys just one that kind of ties in an interesting way with historical discussions about time and existence. So one of Einstein's best friends, Michael Besso, died very unexpectedly a few years before Einstein himself died. And Einstein wrote this famous letter consoling Besso's widow, who was just devastated by Besso's death. And he said, look, I can give you a bit of hope. If you take the theory of special relativity seriously, we realize that the manifold theory, the B theory, which is not what Einstein would have called it, is true. And so Besso's not really gone. He's just in your past light cone. He's just in that part of the manifold now. But that's no reason to despair. I mean, all of us are going to just occupy whatever part of the manifold that we're going to occupy over the course of our lives, but death is not going to be the end of this. So you should buck up. And of course, it's probably the meanest letter of consolation that you could possibly send. I doubt it worked on Besso's widow, but it does raise this really interesting question. If we start to accept this metaphysical model of time, can it be at all therapeutic when we think about questions like whether or not it's rational to be afraid of death, or what it is for us to value events in our future versus events in our past? That's a question that I'm deeply interested in. And that's not a question that we just discovered with the theory of relativity. It was a question that's like the core of Stoic and Roman philosophy. So if you ever read the epic poet Lucretius, De Rerum Natura is his poem where he's trying to show all the different ways that philosophy can provide therapy and thinking about our lives in the universe. And Lucretius has this very famous argument in the midst of that poem where he says a lot of us seem to be afraid of death because we're afraid of facing a future where we won't exist, where we won't be part of reality. But if we think for just a moment about the fact that there was this huge expanse of history in our past light cone where we didn't exist, and we realize that we're not at all terrified of the fact that we weren't born earlier or that we didn't fill up that part of history, that same kind of attitude should be what guides us when we think about the vast future of which we will not be a part. And Lucretius was offering this as a way of trying to help you realize that through philosophical thinking, you could start to overcome your fear of death. Maybe if your doctor gives you a really bad diagnosis, this is the kind of thing you could use to tell yourself that, in fact, even though it seems like you're anxious about missing out on something in the future, in reality, there's nothing valuable that you could possibly miss out on there. And this has been a debate for philosophers reading the Stoics ever since, is like, is there an important psychological or moral difference between the past and the future, even if a manifold theory about the reality of the past and future turns out to be inaccurate or physically useless? that's a super interesting debate, because normally we think that learning new things about reality should influence our ethical and rational decision making. Is time an area where our folk concepts of time, we want to be in a certain sense immune from discoveries that come from physics or logic? It's a really interesting puzzle. I think couple final thoughts if you want to start to get a handle on how philosophers debate these questions. I definitely wouldn't recommend just like dipping into the Philosophical Review or dipping into any of our major journals where, as in many fields, these debates start with like really small epicycles of people fighting each other over really nitpicky things. A debate that you'll see quite often in journal articles right now concerns the logic of quantifiers. So the ways that you have these philosophy of time debates in the language of first and second order logic is a really hot topic right now. If you're just coming at philosophy for the first time and you don't have any experience in symbolic logic, don't touch that stuff because it's not going to be particularly helpful. Some resources that are helpful. Me and some colleagues just finished an entry for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on time, which kind of surveys the literature from the last 50 years and gives some handholds, and that's really geared towards PhD students in philosophy who are just starting to learn the ropes. That would certainly be true for any of the academics in your audience. It definitely takes a very analytic philosophy approach to these questions, and there are certainly really interesting questions about time that you get from Heidegger or from post-Kantian philosophy that are covered elsewhere in the SEP. Obviously, recommend my book. There's also a really wonderful book by Bradford Scow at MIT called Objective Becoming, which deals with these questions about how philosophers and physicists can talk to each other about these issues of temporal passage and determinism. And I think his book is certainly approachable on the philosophy side and probably boils things down significantly enough for physicists to start to approach it. On the psychology end, there's all kinds of really interesting work that's happening right now that's right at the intersection of debates about personal identity and philosophy and ways that we measure phenomenon like time discounting and social psychology. And I think the very best guy working on this is a fellow named Eugene Caruso, who's a psychologist at UCLA. He is very well versed in this philosopher named Derek Parfit, who's a really important writer on personal identity and time. And he basically takes these thought experiments that have been extremely important in the last 30 years in philosophy and then gives them as real experiments to subjects and measures their preferences and their attitudes as a result. So he's doing very interesting work and is quite conversant in philosophy. But those are some places that I might start off if you're interested in these questions. I'm obviously very excited to engage with the time team. I'm very glad that this kind of work is happening because I think if there's any topic in philosophy that lends itself to this kind of interdisciplinary methodology, it's the philosophy of time. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a first question already from Sean Power.
Hi, Megan. Can you
Hi.
hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your question. Thanks very much for your talk. I'm really glad to be able to ask you questions. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I should say on the outset, I am a philosopher, and I guess I'm a B theorist. So I really appreciate your distinction there. On a smaller side, I'm not entirely sure I think you've presented the two most extreme views on either side, and I think I float in between somewhere there, because I think that, well, anyway, I just think that the idea of time doesn't actually, the idea of a B theorist view of time doesn't require space and time to be blended into each other as a space-time manifold, but that's a separate issue, so it's not really important. One thing I was interested in, though, is one thing I was struggling with, because I was just working actually on the idea of rationality about time given B theory and about things like fear of death as opposed to fear of birth. And I was wondering if you would be willing to say something more about that, the idea that, you know, we can get the idea that we fear death, and one argument is because we fear death because it kind of ends our ability to do things. But why is it that we don't, and it's the edge of our lives, as it were, edge of our temporary lives, why is it we don't fear birth? Because that's an edge of our temporary lives as well. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to kind of talk about that, because I'm pretty sure you've thought about that. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Where are you at? Where are you doing your work?
I am in Ireland, in Cork.
Great. Yeah, Ireland has a great, Dublin has a really great metaphysics group on time right now, too. So Ireland's kind of got a center for analytic philosophy of time. Yes, on time and rationality. This could take up like another 7 hours. I have very strong feelings about this. Well, the subject of this book project and a lot of my research has been investigating and ultimately defending a theory that I call temporal neutrality. The basic view is, one, I'm an atheorist, so I do think that there are forms of change that aren't reducible to locations in a space-time manifold. I don't think I have like decisive evidence for why the A theory is true, but I don't think the B theorists do either. And I really want there to be free will and really want there to be important distinctions between the past and the future. I think the B theorists have a hard time explaining the directionality of time. They clearly struggle with thermodynamics and they struggle with some results in quantum mechanics. So I think that's a like toss-up question, but I align more with the let's build philosophical models that take the past, present, future distinction quite seriously. Which makes it all the more surprising that I think in reality we should take the past, present, future distinction very seriously, but in our ethical and rational lives we should ignore it. And that's a big part of this this research project. What do I mean by ignoring it? Well, as our colleagues in psychology know, but we honestly didn't even quite need them, we know it just at a minute of reflection. We do tend to care less about events in our lives as they're scheduled further into our future or as they're scheduled into our past. For instance, for weeks now, I was looking forward to Thanksgiving dinner. And as it got closer, I valued the event even more. And now that it happened yesterday, I care very little about it. This is an example of a temporal discounting function where I put most of my value around instances that are in the nearby future or happening right now. We know that we do this, and psychologists can measure like what kinds of trade-offs would I trade, like a really excellent vacation 5 years from now for a really mediocre one a week from now? How much am I willing to delay a routine dental appointment? These are all ways of telling like how I value pain and pleasure as it's scheduled further into my future, or if it's to discover that it's already happened in my past. My very controversial view, which I've not given you any arguments to support here, is that if we're rational agents, once we've taken into account risk, the probabilities of various events happening, we shouldn't care about the temporal variables at all. Which means that I should care just as much about Thanksgiving next year as I cared about Thanksgiving yesterday, as long as I'm certain the Thanksgivings are going to happen and carry a certain amount of joy with them. I should be putting a lot of money into my retirement account because the power of compound interest means that small amounts of money now will be worth large sums of money later, we hope. And I have relative confidence in the persistence of global capitalism and the market. So that means I should care just as much about my welfare when I'm 65 as I do now. Likewise, we should care in a meaningful way about things that have already occurred in our life, even if we don't have any power to change those probabilities now. Those probabilities are completely fixed by the fact that the past itself is fixed. So I think quite a bit about these questions. How do we argue about topics in rationality? The way philosophers do it is typically in two ways. If you want to convince somebody that a theory of rationality is true, first, you try to provide arguments that if they followed the theory, their life would go better by their own lights. So you take some theory of like well-being as background, as for granted, and then you show that if somebody followed your principles, they would do better than if somebody followed an alternative set of principles. And that requires a bit of calculation, but also requires logical argument. Another way that you argue for a theory of rationality is by trying to point out that if somebody doesn't follow your theory, their views are arbitrary. So their views are not based properly in reasons, and of course philosophers prize living a life that's governed by reason. So you might say, as kind of channeling Einstein's letter to Besso's widow, if physics says there's really no difference between the past and the future anymore, and you care about only caring about things where there's a real difference, you don't want arbitrary preferences, then you shouldn't care about your past versus your future. And that would be a kind of non-arbitrariness argument. So I think quite a bit about those in the book and whether or not they work and how you try to resist them or object to them. But I'm very interested in all of these puzzles. Why is death bad? Oh, that's $1 million question. It definitely is bad. I don't know. I think, another a response to Lucretius could be that instead of thinking you don't have fear of missing out anymore about the future, you do start to get pissed off that you weren't born earlier. Like you can obviously, the response to a lot of the Stoic arguments is not always like tamping down on your emotions. You also always have the option of turning them up and being like, yeah, it's kind of garbage that I wasn't around in the 60s. I would love more life whenever I got it. And I think in some of my like more hyperbolic moments, I think that that's the right approach. But I don't have a good theory about death stuff yet. And death is one of these great interdisciplinary topics in philosophy of time.
That's great. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. I'm just, okay, I think I'm.
Oh, you're muted.
Here, I should be unmuted now. Okay, so I have a number of questions on the list here, but I just wanted to say time is precious at the moment. We have a finite amount of minutes left because Megan is heading off to her dinner. So can we keep questions and answers brief? And I would also like to open the question because we have been asking obviously specific questions to each of the presenters, but maybe we can think about ways also how the papers speak to one another. I think they all have tried to bridge this divide that we've been talking about, the two cultures. In a way, all papers have tried to address both sides of the cultures from their kind of various perspectives. But I think Alex, you had the first question. So if you, sorry, the first one is, okay. I don't have that on the chat though.
I got them. So I got Jutta first, and then Thomas, and then Alex.
Yeah, my question also relates to what Toralf has suggested, just to bridge us a little bit. Coming from a cultural background and viewing the Zoom performance before, where there was a kind of discussion after it about also cultural differences, possible cultural difference of how we perceive of time, and myself giving the paper, so to speak, I was wondering to which extent, and probably as an analytical philosopher, you might have been asked this before, but to which extent do you account for cultural differences, so to speak, in your conception of time? This refers specifically to what you have presented as A and B theories, because they seem to me, and obviously we are all somehow bound to what we do, but isn't that what you do a very kind of westernized approach? And I was wondering whether when you talked about relativity, yeah, whether there might be some kind of space, so to speak, for accounting for cultural differences, or do you disregard that at all? I wonder specifically because you've emphasized so much death, and death is a concept experienced, thought of, ritualized so differently in different cultures. But what I say, this starts also hopefully to bridge and to do introduce a kind of interdisciplinary discussion.
Yeah, I think when we come to, as I said, philosophers of all stripes are interested in these unifying projects of finding ways in which our fundamental concepts end up being much more similar than we may have initially thought superficially, or when it turns out that there are deep inconsistencies or differences. That's also an interesting philosophical upshot. And I think a lot of analytic philosophers are very interested in observing cultural differences and then wanting to learn a little bit more about what underlies them. Topics that tend to come up in my area, and here I think my approach to this in our institute and in my own work is to just try to state my views and hypotheses very clearly, and then let the evidence come in from other sides, especially if it turns out that there are assumptions that we're making that aren't universal or that are in fact very, very limited. If once you've stated your theory clearly, then you have a chance for that kind of criticism. But topics that are super interesting, obviously, Mandarin is a weak tense language in the sense that in Mandarin, if you want to describe the past or the future, I'm not a Chinese speaker, I'm not a Mandarin speaker, but my understanding is you talk about it as temporal locations. So you talk about Megan on Wednesday or Megan in 2050. Versions of it that are more locational than a strong tense language like English. That's really interesting. Those seem to be different ways of representing the more A theory versions of time and more B theory versions of time or constructs of time. We also know that there are really different cultural constructs around planning for the future and on whether a self versus a family or a social unit matters that would be relevant to how language evolves and to how an individual navigates her duties in a society like that, and to what counts as meeting some normative success standard like rationality in these different societies. So there will be some really significant cultural differences. What does that mean for how we understand if there are any logical principles that govern everybody when they think about time? I think that's an interesting puzzle that noticing those differences raises. It also practically raises really interesting puzzles when globalization starts, and it turns out that that I'm interacting quite a bit with somebody who's coming at time from these really different cultural constructs. I did my sabbatical when I was writing the Time Biases book in Singapore and in Hong Kong, so I was kind of right in this middle ground of two worlds. Singapore is like got one foot really firmly in Eastern traditions and one foot very firmly in the British banking world. And so you could see this interplay of trying to figure out how do you do an ad scheme encouraging people to save for retirement in China. Like, you don't do a very self-interested or like really individualized version of that. You also presuppose that they find it quite natural to think about their future self as existing out there or existing in a location. But people in Singapore still don't save enough for retirement, and you have this like background normative consideration that the people's folk views of time are ones that you want to change because there's a rational standard that we could do better at approaching. I'm very interested in all that. Obviously, as you enter more of these variables into the discussion, it gets much harder to try to decide which evidence is more relevant than others and to grasp your hands around it. And this is obviously why they pay these institutes for advanced study the big bucks, is to try to then sort it out once you've got all of these like thousands of sources of evidence coming in. But I take those views very seriously, and I think the best we can do is kind of represent our starting points as clearly as possible and then let people have at it.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, hello. Thanks for these presentations. I think that was really exciting. And this question is for everybody, I think, for all three presenters. Because as an engineer, you know, we use time as a variable, and equations are patient. So you can do all kinds of tricks with time. We use discrete time, we use cyclical time, all very much interesting things. And it also, sometimes we use two-dimensional time. But the one thing that we always assume is that time has a direction. You know, there is a progression that goes into the direction of the future. And we play lots of tricks with our equations to make sure we capture this notion of progress and the concept of causality. So how do you think, how is the experience of causality and time related? Is that maybe a good question to ask? Oops.
Megan?
I think maybe Megan goes first, and we give the others a chance as well to join.
So the question is, are experience of causation or causation and time related? I think because those are two different questions. I think it's interesting for either of the first two speakers can talk a little bit about what it means to like measure or observe causation, because that's obviously a topic that comes up quite a bit in the arts and just in general investigating how all of the manifold weird ways that we experience time and causation. And in physics, obviously, like measuring and making observations about simultaneity and causation is the million-dollar question of the last 120 years. For philosophers, they're obviously intimately related. There's certainly a question about whether or not there could be a concept of time in a world that has absolutely no causation. Something like Augustine weighed in on that question. I find it very strange to think about time passing without there being any kind of meaningful sense of causal laws operating, but that's all purely conceptual. For the experience question, I don't know. It seems like there's lots of different ways that we experience both time and causation, and when they match up and when they don't is really puzzling. And happy to turn it over to Jutta or Lauren.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Sorry.
The one thing I could answer to that is actually that in that one concept where what I have described, what in the Middle Ages is the kind of nunc, the actualis, the kind of now, I don't think you would have any kind of causation. You would not think of it. It's just a bodily presence. And in that bodily presence, you would not have a concept of that. Having said that, and having been talking about performance art, when you then step outside of that, obviously performance art wants to have a causal effect. One of the reasons for that is actually producing out of these performances that were sometimes done in the 1970s, and therefore now being available on YouTube, but not more widely and cannot be actually seen. Yeah, they are then documented in videos as well as in photographs or stills, and they are sold. And this is actually the background for them, because there is a causal effect for the artist to somehow get it known to start off with, but also obviously to earn some money. But in that kind of what I have described as this one type of understanding the presence and the present as presence, you wouldn't have a concept of causation.
So I will try to be brief. As a physicist, I could ask lots of questions, but I will ask a question concerning actually an ethics of different approaches to time. Any person essentially is determined by this person's past. It's kind of cumulative process. And we know that value in many cases is determined by the amount of time we spend to reach this value, in particular in labor theory of value. So the property in a sense is a condensed time, and so in a sense is a condensed life. So the question is whether it makes sense to make a difference between violent crime against a person, which is a crime against somebody existing now, and a crime against property, which is essentially a crime against the same person in the past.
Is this a question for me? So I definitely think that is an important distinction and that I hope to continue to live in a justice system that recognizes it. I think there's obviously a really interesting question about where we get evidence for normative theories and how much physical model that's really well established and useful in physics can come and propose a really radical revision to a theory in ethics or rationality. I think in general, when it comes to normative just means like anytime philosophy is dealing with a should question, should we send this person to prison for longer or shorter? Should we save more money for retirement? One big source of evidence for that are other normative beliefs and what we consider to be common sense or deeply ingrained cultural or historical views about the nature of justice or the nature of what a person is. A person itself is a normatively loaded concept. So it'd be very strange, even if you're right that like hard determinism is true, which I'm not even 100% sure that I believe that. But even if you're right about the physics, whether or not that would be powerful enough evidence to overwrite the ethical, common sense, rational intuitions that also play into these theories. It